The Galactic University's Xenobiology 101 classroom looked like what would happen if someone let a committee of aliens design a lecture hall after watching exactly one human university brochure. Floating holographic displays buzzed around crystalline seats that somehow accommodated everything from tentacled blob creatures to insectoid beings with way too many joints. The air recycling system worked overtime, managing the atmospheric needs of 12 different species while maintaining what the administration optimistically called breathable for most. Professor Kelverth stood at the front of the class, his 7-foot frame covered in what looked like purple velvet but was probably some kind of specialized skin. His 4 eyes rotated independently as he surveyed his students with the kind of smug satisfaction that only came from decades of academic tenure and the unshakable belief that he was the smartest being in any room. Today, class, we will be discussing extinction events and their impact on planetary ecosystems, Kelverth announced, his voice carrying that particular tone professors used when they were about to say something they thought was profound. As advanced beings, we have moved beyond the primitive cycle of species elimination that plagued our ancestors. The students nodded along dutifully. There was Zara, a blue-scaled reptilian whose species had achieved interstellar travel before humans figured out agriculture. Blorg, a nervous jellyfish-like creature who seemed to vibrate with anxiety at all times. Various other alien students representing civilizations that had been spacefaring for millennia. And then there was Jake Morrison. Jake sat in the back corner, the only human in a class of beings whose civilizations considered Earth a backwater planet that had just barely qualified for galactic community membership. He was scribbling notes on an actual paper notebook, because apparently 22nd century technology still couldn't improve on the ancient art of doodling in margins during boring lectures. Now then, Professor Kelvarth continued, clearly building to what he considered his pedagogical masterstroke. Can anyone provide examples of extinct species from their homeworld? Remember, we're looking for species that your civilizations learned to coexist with, not eliminate. Several alien hands, tentacles, and appendages shot up. Students began rattling off examples of creatures that had died out due to natural climate shifts, cosmic radiation, or peaceful evolutionary transitions. Each example was met with approving nods and academic murmurs about natural selection and environmental adaptation. Professor Kelverth was practically glowing with self-satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of enlightened discussion that proved how much more advanced these civilizations were compared to primitive species that might resort to, say, actually hunting their planet's fauna. Then Jake raised his hand. "Oh yes, Human Morrison," Kelverth said, his tone suggesting he was being graciously inclusive of the class's least evolved member. "I'm sure your species has some interesting examples of natural extinction events." Jake straightened up in his chair and cleared his throat. "Well, I can name about 47 species off the top of my head that I've personally hunted." The classroom fell silent. Not the kind of silence that happens when someone says something mildly interesting. This was the silence that happens when someone casually mentions they've committed what sounds like genocide as a hobby. Professor Kelverth's 4 eyes stopped rotating and focused entirely on Jake with the intensity of someone trying to process whether they'd just heard a confession to mass extinction events. "I'm sorry," Kelverth said slowly. "Did you say you've personally hunted 47 extinct species?" "Yup," Jake replied cheerfully, completely oblivious to the fact that every being in the room was now staring at him like he'd just announced he collected sentient species' skulls for fun. "Been doing it since I was a kid, actually. My dad got me started when I was about 8. Family tradition, you know." The silence stretched longer. Somewhere in the back of the room, Blorg's nervous vibration had intensified to the point where his desk was starting to shake. "That's quite impressive," Professor Kelverth managed, his academic composure warring with what was starting to feel like a very real need to contact galactic security. "And these species, they're all extinct now?" "Oh yeah, completely gone," Jake confirmed with the casual tone of someone discussing weekend plans. "Some of them have been extinct for millions of years. Makes the hunt more challenging, but also more rewarding, you know?" Professor Kelvarth's purple complexion had shifted to what might have been a paler shade of horrified. Zara was the first to break the silence, her blue scales literally standing on end like some kind of reptilian alarm system. You've killed 47 entire species?" Her voice carried the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for documentaries about galactic war crimes. "Well, not entire species," Jake clarified helpfully, missing the point by roughly the distance between Earth and the nearest black hole. "I mean, they were already extinct when I got to them. I just tracked them down, you know? Follow the clues, piece together their habits, figure out where they lived." Lorg's vibration had reached earthquake levels. The jellyfish-like creature seemed to be having some kind of anxiety-induced seizure at the thought of sharing a classroom with what he clearly believed was the galaxy's most casual mass murderer. But surely, Professor Kelvorth interjected, his academic brain still trying to process this information in a way that didn't require him to call security. Your species has laws against this kind of recreational extinction? Jake laughed, which did absolutely nothing to improve the situation. Laws? No, it's totally legal. Hell, there are whole museums dedicated to it. My uncle works at one, actually. He's got way more kills than me, probably in the hundreds. A soft thudding sound came from the direction of Blorg's desk. Apparently the stress had finally gotten to him, and he'd fainted, his gelatinous form now spread across his chair like nervous pudding. Museums, Zara repeated slowly, her reptilian brain trying to wrap itself around the concept of institutions dedicated to celebrating genocide. You have museums for extinction. Oh yeah, tons of them, Jake said with growing enthusiasm. The Natural History Museum back home has an incredible collection. You should see their Tyrannosaurus Rex display, it's amazing. Took them years to track down all the pieces for that one. Professor Kelvorth felt what could only be described as his academic world crumbling. Here he was, trying to teach a class about civilized approaches to extinction events, and he had a student casually describing what sounded like an entire human industry built around species elimination. And your family participates in this activity? Kelvorth asked, his voice barely above a whisper. My whole family's into it, Jake confirmed proudly. My sister's actually better at it than I am. She found a complete stegosaurus last summer. Took her 3 weeks of digging, but she got the whole skeleton. Dad was so proud he mounted it in the living room. The classroom had descended into a kind of shocked stupor. Various alien students were exchanging glances that clearly said, did we accidentally admit a genocidal maniac into our university? You mount them? Asked a crystalline being whose name was mostly unpronounceable, but sounded like wind chimes having an argument. Oh, sure, Jake said, warming to his topic. I've got a trophy room back home. Nothing too fancy, but I've got some nice pieces. Found a triceratops skull when I was 12. That's still my favorite. Spent weeks cleaning it up, getting all the sediment out of the bone structure. Really satisfying work. Professor Kelvorth realized he was facing a pedagogical crisis of unprecedented proportions. Not only was his lesson about civilized extinction completely derailed, but he was apparently hosting a confessed serial species killer who kept trophies and had somehow convinced his entire planet that this behavior was not only acceptable, but worthy of museum displays. I think, Professor Kelvorth said carefully, we need to contact the appropriate authorities about this matter. Jake looked confused. Authorities? Why? Is there a permit process for off-world hunting? Because I hadn't really thought about that, but if there are regulations... The professor's 4 eyes began spinning in different directions, which in his species was generally considered a sign of impending nervous breakdown. 20 minutes later, Professor Kelvorth found himself in his office, frantically composing what was possibly the most disturbing report in galactic university history. His communication device buzzed as he connected to the Galactic Peace Corps emergency hotline. Peace Corps Emergency Services, this is Operator Vex. How can we help you maintain galactic harmony today? Yes, hello, this is Professor Kelvorth at Galactic University. I need to report a possible war criminal in my xenobiology class. There was a pause. Sir, did you say war criminal? Species exterminator, actually. Possibly worse. He's claiming to have personally hunted 47 extinct species and is apparently part of some kind of organized elimination network. Back in the classroom, Jake had no idea he was about to become the subject of an interstellar manhunt. He was enthusiastically showing Zara photos on his personal device, completely missing the fact that she looked like she was about to molt from pure stress. See, this is from my trip to Montana last year, Jake said, swiping through images. Spent 2 weeks tracking this particular specimen. Look at the bone structure on this thing, absolutely incredible. You can see where I had to excavate around the ribcage, really delicate work. Zara stared at what appeared to be Jake crouched next to a massive skeletal structure, grinning like he'd just accomplished something wonderful, instead of something that should probably result in intergalactic sanctions. And this, Jake continued, clearly in his element, is my hunting party from that expedition. Great group of people, we've been hunting together for years. The photo showed Jake with 5 other humans, all holding various tools and looking pleased with themselves. To Zara's horrified reptilian brain, it looked like a death squad posing with their excavation equipment after a successful species elimination mission. You work in teams, Zara said weakly. Oh yeah, you have to for the big ones. Some of these specimens are massive. You need a whole crew to extract them properly. My buddy Mike there, he's got the best equipment for deep digs. Sarah's our expert on preservation techniques. She knows exactly how to handle delicate bone structures without damaging them. Zara's scales were now making a soft rattling sound, which in her species typically indicated either extreme fear or the onset of total psychological breakdown. And you preserve them, she managed. Absolutely. What's the point of hunting if you don't preserve your find properly? Sarah's got this whole process down to a science. Chemical treatments, stabilization procedures, mounting techniques. She can take something that's been buried for millions of years and make it look like it died yesterday. Professor Kelverth chose that moment to return to the classroom, followed by what appeared to be several very serious-looking galactic security officers. The professor's 4 eyes were still spinning, but now they seemed to be spinning with purpose. "Human Morrison," Kelverth announced with the gravity of someone about to prevent an interstellar incident. "These officers would like to examine your evidence." Jake looked up, confused but cooperative. "Evidence? Oh, you mean my photos? Sure thing." He handed over his device cheerfully, completely missing the fact that the security officers were handling it like it contained documentation of crimes against sentience itself. "This shows your hunting activities?" asked the lead officer, a being that looked like someone had crossed a mantis with a very serious bureaucrat. "My best ones, yeah. That's 3 years of expeditions right there. Some really rare finds, too. That velociraptor took me 6 months to track down." The security officer's antennae twitched in what was probably the insectoid equivalent of barely controlled horror. The lead security officer, Commander Zixt, had dealt with smugglers, pirates, and the occasional rogue AI, but nothing in his training had prepared him for what appeared to be a cheerful confession to systematic species elimination. He scrolled through Jake's photos with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for evidence that would be presented at intergalactic war crimes tribunals. "This image shows you at an excavation site," Commander Zixt said carefully, his mandibles clicking in barely controlled agitation. "Can you explain what happened to the creature you discovered here?" Jake squinted at the photo and brightened. "Oh, that one. That was amazing. Took 3 days to get him out of the ground, but it was totally worth it. Look at the condition of those bones. Nearly perfect preservation after 65 million years. We had to use brushes and dental picks for the delicate work around the skull." The commander's grip on the device tightened. "You used dental picks?" "Tiny tools, yeah. You have to be really careful when you're extracting them, especially around the facial bones. One wrong move and you can destroy millions of years of history." Jake's enthusiasm was reaching dangerous levels. "The skull was the best part, though. Got it back to the lab, cleaned it up, and now it's on display at the university. People come from all over just to see it." "Display," Commander Zixt repeated slowly. "You put the remains on public display." "Well, sure, what's the point of finding something that incredible if you don't share it with people? Education, you know. Kids love seeing the big predators. There's something about a massive set of jaws that really captures the imagination." Zara, who had been listening to this exchange with growing horror, finally found her voice. "You show children the remains of your victims." Jake looked genuinely confused for the first time. "Victims? What do you mean, victims?" Professor Kelverth stepped forward, his academic composure finally cracking entirely. "Human Morrison, we need you to explain exactly when these species extinctions occurred." "Oh, well, that varies," Jake said, clearly trying to be helpful. "The Tyrannosaurus rex went extinct about 65 million years ago, end of the Cretaceous period. The Triceratops was around the same time. Velociraptors were actually a bit earlier, maybe 70 million years ago. The Stegosaurus was way older. Jurassic period, so we're talking 150 million years or so." The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. This was the silence of brains trying to process information that didn't fit into any existing framework of understanding. Commander Zixt was the first to recover. "Did you say 65 million years ago?" "Give or take a few million, yeah. Dating isn't always exact, especially when you're dealing with fossilization processes and sediment layers, but the geological markers are pretty reliable." "Fossilization," Professor Kelverth whispered, his 4 eyes suddenly focusing with laser intensity. "You said fossilization." Jake nodded enthusiastically. "Right, the whole process is fascinating. Basically, when these animals died, they got buried under sediment, and over millions of years, the organic material got replaced by minerals. So what we're actually finding are rock formations that preserve the shape and structure of the original bones." The realization hit the room like a neutron bomb made of pure embarrassment. Commander Zixt slowly lowered Jake's device. So, when you say you hunt these creatures, I track down their fossil remains, yeah. Follow geological surveys, look for rock formations from the right time periods, dig them up, and study them. It's called paleontology. Jake paused, looking around at the sea of stunned alien faces. Wait, what did you guys think I meant? Professor Kelverth felt something that could only be described as his entire academic reputation imploding. Here he was, supposedly an expert in xenobiology, and he had just called galactic security because he didn't understand that humans sometimes dug up old rocks that used to be animals. So you're not actually killing these species, Commander Zixth said slowly. How could I kill something that's been dead for 65 million years? Jake asked, his confusion reaching new heights. I mean, I'm good at what I do, but I'm not a time traveler. Zaro's scales had stopped rattling and were now making a sound that might have been laughter if reptilian beings were capable of laughing at the sheer absurdity of their own terror. And the museums, she managed. They're not celebrating genocide. They're educational institutions, Jake confirmed. We study extinct species to understand evolution, climate change, and the history of life on Earth. It's science. Commander Zixth looked at his fellow officers, then at Professor Kelverth, then back at Jake. So this entire investigation is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of human recreational paleontology. I guess, Jake said, still looking bewildered. Though I have to say, this is the most interest anyone's ever shown in my fossil hunting. Usually people think it's kind of nerdy. The aftermath of the revelation was somehow worse than the original misunderstanding. Commander Zixth stood there holding Jake's device like it had personally betrayed him, while his fellow officers tried to figure out how to write a report explaining that they'd mobilized galactic security forces to investigate a college student's rock collection. So let me understand this correctly, Professor Kelverth said, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone whose expertise had just been publicly demolished. When you said these species were extinct, you meant they died out naturally, millions of years before your species even existed. Well, yeah, Jake said, apparently still not grasping the full scope of the chaos he'd accidentally caused. Humans have only been around for like 300,000 years, give or take. Most of the really cool extinct species died out way before we showed up. Asteroid impacts, climate change, volcanic activity, the usual planetary catastrophes. Zara's reptilian brain was struggling with concepts that her advanced civilization had apparently never needed to consider. You study dead things for recreational purposes. Educational purposes, mostly, Jake corrected, though I guess it is pretty fun. There's something exciting about uncovering something that no one's seen for millions of years, like this pterodon wing bone I found last year. I was probably the first sentient being to touch it since the day that animal died. Lorg, who had finally recovered consciousness and was slowly reconstituting his jellyfish-like form, vibrated with what might have been curiosity instead of terror for the first time all day. But why do you want to touch dead things? That seems unsanitary. Jake laughed, which still made half the class flinch reflexively. They're not exactly dead anymore, they're fossils. All the organic material is gone, replaced by rock minerals. It's like, imagine if you took a perfect sculpture of someone and left it buried underground for millions of years until it turned to stone. That's basically what a fossil is. So your entire planet has developed a recreational interest in ancient stone sculptures, Commander Zixth said, apparently trying to salvage some dignity from the situation by treating it as legitimate xenological research. Not the entire planet, Jake said thoughtfully, though I guess we do have a pretty strong cultural fascination with our prehistoric past. Museums are really popular, dinosaur movies make billions of dollars, kids love toy dinosaurs. Actually, now that I think about it, maybe we are kind of obsessed with extinct species. Professor Kelverth felt his academic world continuing to crumble as he realized that not only had he completely misunderstood human paleontology, but he was now learning that an entire civilization had built a substantial portion of its entertainment industry around creatures that had been dead longer than most galactic civilizations had existed. Your species makes recreational entertainment about extinct animals, Professor Kelverth said slowly. Oh sure, tons of it. Movies, books, TV shows, theme parks. Ever heard of Jurassic Park? Massive franchise about bringing dinosaurs back to life through genetic engineering. Complete science fiction, of course, but people love it. The silence returned, but this time it carried a different quality. Less horror, more the kind of stunned bewilderment that comes from realizing that the universe is far stranger than you'd previously imagined. You make entertainment about hypothetically resurrecting extinct species? Zara said, her scales starting to ripple in what might have been fascination rather than fear. Well, we know it's impossible with current technology, Jake clarified. DNA degrades too much over millions of years, but it's fun to imagine what it would be like if we could bring back a Tyrannosaurus Rex, or a Brontosaurus, though honestly it would probably be a terrible idea. Those things were perfectly adapted killing machines. Commander Zixt's antennae were now twitching with what appeared to be scientific curiosity. Your species fantasizes about recreating apex predators from your planet's distant past. I mean, when you put it like that, it does sound kind of insane, Jake admitted. But humans have always been fascinated by dangerous things we can't actually encounter. It's like safe thrills, you know? We get to imagine what it would be like to face a 20-foot-tall carnivore without actually risking getting eaten by one. Professor Kelverth realized that his simple lesson about extinction events had somehow evolved into a masterclass in human psychology that was simultaneously making his species seem more fascinating and more disturbing than he'd ever imagined. So, your museums, your fossil hunting, your entertainment industry, Professor Kelverth said carefully, it's all based on your species' recreational relationship with death and extinction. Jake paused, apparently considering this for the first time. Huh. Yeah, I guess it kind of is. We really do spend a lot of time thinking about things that are dead. That's actually pretty weird when you put it like that. The classroom had transformed from a place of academic learning into something resembling a xenopsychological research session, with Jake as the unwitting subject, demonstrating that humans were somehow even more bizarre than anyone had previously suspected. Professor Kelverth stood at the front of his classroom, looking at the assembled group of alien students, galactic security officers, and one obliviously cheerful human, and realized that his carefully planned lesson about extinction events had become the most educational disaster of his academic career. His 4 eyes had finally stopped spinning and were now focused with the kind of intense concentration that comes from trying to salvage what remained of one's professional dignity. Well, Professor Kelverth said, clearing his throat with a sound like gravel being processed through a universal translator, I believe we have all learned something valuable today about the importance of thorough research before drawing conclusions. Commander Zixt, who was still trying to figure out how to explain to his superiors that the galactic security alert had been triggered by a paleontology hobby, nodded gravely. Indeed. Perhaps in the future, Professor, you might want to include a brief questionnaire about recreational activities before assuming species-level genocide. Jake, finally beginning to grasp the scope of the misunderstanding, raised his hand tentatively. So, just to be clear, you all thought I was some kind of mass murderer because I dig up dinosaur bones? The evidence was quite compelling, Zara said defensively, her scales settling into a pattern that suggested embarrassment. You had photographs, you mentioned hunting parties, you talked about preservation techniques and trophy rooms. What were we supposed to think? That I'm a really enthusiastic amateur paleontologist? Jake suggested. Blorg, who had finally achieved stable jellyfish form, quivered thoughtfully. In our defense, no one mentioned that humans collect the remains of dead creatures as a form of entertainment. That seems like important cultural information that should have been included in the orientation materials. Professor Kelverth winced. The orientation materials were his responsibility, and he was beginning to realize that his comprehensive guide to primitive human behaviors had somehow failed to mention that humans had turned extinction into a recreational activity. Perhaps, Professor Kelverth said slowly, Human Morrison would be willing to give a guest lecture on human paleontological practices. For educational purposes, of course. Jake's face lit up with the kind of enthusiasm that had started this whole mess. Really? That would be awesome. I could bring some of my fossil casts, maybe do a presentation on geological timescales, talk about the different extinction events. Oh, and I've got this great collection of Cretaceous period specimens that would blow your minds. The phrase, blow your minds, caused a brief moment of renewed panic until everyone remembered they were dealing with metaphorical language rather than actual cranial explosions. Commander Zixt began packing up his equipment with the weary efficiency of someone who had spent his day investigating rocks instead of war crimes. I'll need to file a report about this incident. What exactly should I classify human paleontology under? Scientific research? Recreational tomb raiding? Necromantic archaeology? Let's go with cultural xenological interest in planetary history, Professor Kelverth suggested quickly, already imagining the paperwork nightmare that would result from having necromantic archaeology in an official galactic security report. As the security officers filed out, muttering about the need for better cultural briefings on primitive species, Jake pulled out his device again. Hey, since everyone's so interested in this stuff, want to see the pictures from my trip to the La Brea tar pits? I found some amazing Smilodon remains. That's saber-toothed cats for those of you who aren't familiar with Pleistocene megafauna. The collective shudder that ran through the classroom suggested that the aliens were still adjusting to the concept of humans casually discussing ancient predators like they were talking about the weather. You know what, Zara said thoughtfully. I'm actually starting to understand why your species is so resilient. If you spend your free time thinking about every possible way life can be extinct, you probably develop a pretty good survival instinct. Jake considered this. I never thought about it that way, but you might be right. We do seem to have a talent for surviving things that should probably kill us. Professor Kelverth realized that what had started as his most embarrassing professional moment was actually turning into a genuine learning experience. His students were asking questions, engaging with xenological concepts, and demonstrating exactly the kind of critical thinking he'd been trying to encourage all semester. Class dismissed, he announced, but I expect everyone to attend Human Morrison's guest lecture next week. And perhaps we should all consider what other assumptions we might be making about species we consider primitive. As the students filed out, chattering excitedly about their newly discovered human classmates' bizarre recreational habits, Jake packed up his notebook and headed for the door. He paused at Professor Kelverth's desk. Professor, thanks for letting me explain all that. It was fun. Oh, and just so you know, I'm planning to go hunting again this weekend. Professor Kelverth's eyes began spinning again before Jake quickly added, The Natural History Museum is opening a new exhibit on Permian period marine fossils. Should be a great hunt. As Jake left the classroom, Professor Kelverth sat down heavily in his chair and made a mental note to completely rewrite the section of a xenobiology curriculum dealing with human cultural practices. Apparently, turning extinction into entertainment was just another Tuesday for Earth's most persistent species. The galaxy, he reflected, was a much stranger place than any academic textbook had ever adequately prepared him for.